Hey guys, in this video I'll be doing an in-depth guide to ProStacker for Adobe Photoshop. To anyone who's unfamiliar with ProStacker, it is a tool designed to combine many images into a single Photoshop document, or to stack many files into a single document. And it also opens the door to a series of automation and efficiency enhancing workflows based around the fact that metadata from the source files is embedded into each Photoshop layer created. Now, as ProStacker is an extension for Adobe Photoshop, you can open it by going Window, Extensions, ProStacker. In this video, I'll be using the 1-month free trial, which is available for download from the Adobe Exchange. So before going any further, let's start with how to stack files. Okay then, so I'll begin by pressing the Load Files button here, which will open up the file selection dialog. I can grab this selection of stock photos here, I'll push OK, and you'll see that they've been added to the list of files to be loaded. At this point, I won't do anything else, I'll just push OK, and the stacking process will begin. You can see that the percentage bar is charting the progress of the files being loaded. We can also see which number file is currently being opened out of the total number. We've got the name of the file being opened, as well as the estimated time remaining for the whole process. I can also pause and stop the stacking process down here, which I'll show you in a moment. Another way to choose which files you want to load is to select by folder rather than file name. I can do that by clicking the little icon of the folder up here, which will open the folder selection dialog. I'm in the same location as I was a moment ago, so I can just go select folder, and you can see the name of that folder has been added to the list here, along with a little icon of a folder to show you it's a folder. There's a couple more settings which have appeared here that I'll speak about a bit later in the video. For now, once again, I'll just push OK. You can see the stacking process has begun exactly the same as last time. It gets the contents of the folder whenever the process begins. I can pause the stacking process at this point. You can see that the text of this button has changed to the word resume. It used to say pause. And at this point, I've got control of Photoshop once again. I can go back to these files that we loaded a moment ago. I can access the menu up here. It's back to normal. Just while it's paused, I'll mention that just like Photoshop's load files into stack script, whenever a larger image is loaded into the stacking process, the canvas size will be enlarged to suit that new image size. Also, whenever images of a higher bit depth are loaded, the bit depth of the document will update as well. So in this regard, it's really the same operation as Photoshop scripts. You're mostly benefiting by having the UI and the controls down here. So at this point, I'll mention just before I resume that if you want to stop the stacking process, you can push the stop button while it's running, or you can also click the cross up in here just to close the window. So I'll resume it now, and then I'll stop the process just to show you. So I'll press resume. It's going to pick up exactly where it was before. I'll click the X up here. The dialog will close, it will finish the file it was doing, and then it will stop. So I'm back to being in control again. That's basically it if you wanted to just load the files in. For the rest of this video, I'll be exploring some of the options and various benefits ProStacker brings to you with the particular special way in which the images are loaded into Photoshop. In this next section of the video, I'll be talking about what options ProStacker gives you for how files are loaded into Photoshop. So you can access the options by clicking this button here, and you'll see that the options menu expands upwards. The first one is Load Files As. If I click this drop down here, you see that we have a choice between normal layers, smart objects, and linked smart objects. Normal layers is the default choice. That's what we were using in the previous examples like this document here. I'll show you now what it's like if we go Smart Objects. I'll go back to the file selection here, go Load Files. I'll just grab a few of them this time, we don't need all of them. And I'll go OK. You can see that the files load exactly as before, except that this time you might be able to make out the icon is just slightly different, indicating that this is a smart object. when you choose to load files as smart objects, every single layer is its own separate smart object in ProStacker. I'll give you another quick example this time as linked smart objects, but the process is exactly the same. You just have to choose it from the drop-down arrow. I'll go OK. And hopefully you can make out the icon is just slightly different for these ones as well, indicating that it's a linked smart object. The next option I'll be speaking about in ProStacker is the destination dropdown. This gives you a choice between new document and current document. New document means that any files which are opened or images combined into a single document will be created as a new document in Photoshop. This is the same as Photoshop's default load files into stack script. ProStacker also gives you the choice to choose current document, which, as the name suggests, means that files will be added to this document you've already got open. I can give you an example here. I've just picked a few more files. I've got it set to current document. I can still choose at this point if I want them to be smart objects, linked smart objects, or normal layers. I'll go with smart objects again just to show you the combination, and I'll push OK. You can see that at the top of this comp, the smart objects have been added straight into it, just as the name suggests. If I get rid of those for a moment, I also have the choice to drop them into a folder created anywhere in the document as long as it's selected when I choose to run this process. I can pick the files I want, I'll go OK. So once again, let's say smart objects again, and I'll go current document. Because I've got this folder selected, it will be adding the images into there. So if I go OK, you can see that those smart objects are being dropped straight into this folder here. At this point in the video, I'm going to take a couple of minutes to discuss one of the more complicated settings in ProStacker, which is the color profile dropdown when you're choosing to add images to the current document. You'll see if I click this drop-down menu here, we can either go Assign Comp Profile or Convert to Comp Profile. So what does that mean? Basically, at some point while working on your Photoshop document, you may have chosen to change the color profile from that of the incoming images to which started it. In this case, you can see that the images I loaded in earlier were sRGB profile, but in this case I'm going to change it to Adobe RGB 1998. When I do that, if I click on and off this preview button, I hope you can see this in the video, there's a bit of a color shift. In particular, to my eyes, the red of the strawberries is looking quite different between when the color profile is on and off. And if I go OK at this point, the color of our image has now altered. And what's really important, going back to ProStacker for a moment, is that this process that we just applied here, this assigning of the color profile, it must be done equally to any images added to our document when we're choosing to add to current document. To show the importance of getting this right, I'm actually going to pick the wrong setting for a moment. I'm going to choose to add this strawberries image to our document, but this time I'm going to go Convert to Comp Profile, which is it's the wrong thing to do. We should be going Assign. I'll go Convert just to show you why this is important to do. So I'll go Fresh Strawberries, OK, we'll just load it in. And when I flick between these two, I hope it's visible in the image, the colors are quite noticeably different. This one we're looking at now is our main document where we assigned the profile. And if I turn on the layer we just brought in, you can see it actually looks more like the sRGB color profile image we were originally looking at. So this is obviously undesirable. We want there to be complete alignment of our images in terms of their appearance when brought into the file. So if I delete this layer here, I'll show you what it's like if we get the correct settings. So I'm going to stick with the default value here, which is Assign Comp Profile. I'll go Load Files, grab the strawberries image again, we'll go OK. This time, when I flick between the two, you can see there's no color difference at all. The images look absolutely identical, which is how they should be in this scenario. I won't go through every step again, but I'd mention that it is the exact same process if earlier on you had chosen to convert your Photoshop document to a given color profile, all you need to do is remember, if you did do that earlier on, you need to make sure that you choose to convert to comp profile when you're adding images to the current document. I'm going to take a break at this moment from discussing the options for how files are loaded and handled in ProStacker. We'll come back here a bit later on, but I just want to introduce you to one of the key concepts for how images are loaded into Photoshop using ProStacker, which is to talk about the per layer metadata, which is embedded in each image. So if I go over to the metadata tab here, I can click the Get Metadata for Selected Layer button, and you'll see this text box here gets populated with all sorts of information from the file which is embedded into this layer. If I choose at this point to pick a different image, you can see that the information in the box is altering to suit the layer. It's also embedded into smart objects also. So just to introduce the way this information is presented, the first 5 items of metadata will be present on any file opened in Photoshop because this information is accessed via the file system. So it'll tell you the name of the file, it'll tell you the path of the file, the size, the created and modified dates. Beyond these 5 items here, it all comes down to what EXIF information is embedded in the image when it was loaded into Photoshop. As you can see here, these stock photos I'm using, they've got quite a lot of information from the camera, the lens, things like that. Sometimes the date of the photography and other information. So as I'm choosing to get the selected layers metadata, you can see this information changing as I go. This can be particularly useful if, for example, you want to learn a bit more about the images you've got in your Photoshop file, or to pick another example, perhaps you've picked up someone else's Photoshop document and you'd like to know where on the server they found these images which were added into it. In this case, particularly perhaps if they've renamed their layer something else, it can be hard to trace the history of a Photoshop document. Here you can see straight away the server location as to where images are saved, and actually if you do want to open up the folder for where an image came from, you can go over to the Update Files tab and push this button right at the bottom that says Reveal Layer Source Folder. I'll click that, and you can see it opens straight away. Photoshop already had a feature like this for smart objects, and now it can do it for normal layers as well, using this per layer metadata from ProStacker. Another way to access metadata information in the layers, rather than seeing all metadata for a single layer, would be to see a single metadata field for every layer in the scene. For example, if I, from this drop-down menu here, if I choose file size, and then I click this button called Focus Metadata, you can see that I can see the file size for every layer in the comp. I can see, for example, that looks like the largest one. And I can change this to different information as well, perhaps say let's do the focal length. I can see that for the different pictures. One metadata field which is particularly useful with this function is the copyright information. It may be that you have to give copyright attribution or purchase stock images, things like that, and in a flash you can just see any images that have this kind of information embedded into them, and also in cases where there is no copyright information, it'll just say no metadata, so you don't need to worry about that. The last thing I'd mention on this page is that if you want to remove metadata from one layer or all of your layers, you can select the layers you want, go remove metadata from layers. I'll just choose the selected layer for now. I'll go selected layers. And now if I want to test that, I'll go get metadata for selected layer, and it's going to say that there's nothing on the layer. Let's do another test. I'll do the file size again. We'll go focus metadata. All of them have got it, except for the one that I just removed the metadata on, which is this layer here. You can see it says no metadata. If you were to be delivering your Photoshop file to an external client and you didn't want to be sharing all this information, you can choose to go remove metadata from layers, all layers, and at that point everything will be gone. So I can go focus metadata file size, and there's no metadata left at all at this point. In the next few stages of this video, I'll be discussing some of the other features and automation processes available to you using ProStacker once we've got this per layer metadata embedded into each layer. Now that we've been introduced to the per layer metadata in ProStacker, I'd like to start showing you some of the features available which make use of that metadata. For this example, I've gone back to the list of images that was stacked at the beginning of this video. I'm going to go into Options, and this time I'm going to click Group Layers. These features here are basically an automated way of adding images to groups, just like that. In this case, it created a group called Group 1. I'm going to be showing you the ways in which ProStacker can move these layers into groups named for what their content is or a chosen metadata field. I'll come back to this one called Name Fragment a bit later, but for now I'll simply show you an example of how the metadata can be used in this grouping operation. So I've got this drop-down menu here. I can choose some common EXIF metadata, the same file system-based metadata we spoke about a little earlier, or if it's something that isn't on this list and you want to use it for grouping, you can choose the custom drop-down here and type in your own metadata field, which may well be present in these layers, but just not a feature of this drop-down menu here. To begin, I'll just give you an example. I'll choose the camera model. I'll go OK. It's going to say, do you want to group the selected layers or all layers? I'll go all layers at this point. And there you go. You can see it's moved about half of the images into a folder called Canon EOS 5D Mark IV, and the rest are in the Canon EOS 6D. And this just corresponds to the model metadata for each layer in these images. If I want to further group these images into greater subdivisions, I can pick another metadata field, let's say focal length, and I'll go OK, all layers again. And it's effectively done the same process. I can control-click these little drop-down arrows here to close all the folders. And you can see that this time it's moved them into the focal length. So we've got one that's 21mm, quite a few that are 35mm, two that are 50, and one that's 70. So there is really no limit as to how far you go with these various group subdivisions. Let's pick another one. Let's go aperture value. So I'll go OK, once again, all layers. And it's going to go through each folder, each image, and it's going to split them up again. I'll control-click once again. And we can see that this time, for example, because there were several 35mm images, these have been split up into the different aperture values for each shot. In fact, I suppose eventually you'll just get one image per folder, but it shows you how the process works. Another method of grouping layers available in ProStacker is to group by name fragment. This is designed to be used in cases where the metadata values in the available layers are not sufficient for organizing the layers in the way that you want them to be organized, but where there is information in the name of the layers which can be exploited to move the layers usefully into groups. In my personal experience, this is quite useful for grouping CG renders by their render layer into Photoshop groups. I'll show you in this example how to do that. The first thing I'll talk about is this setting here called separator. You'll see in this example here it's set to a dot, a full stop. If I look at the name of this layer here, for example, it says car body rl.gi.exr. So when I'm choosing to set dot as the separator, what we're telling ProStacker is I want you to split this name here by every time you find a dot in it. And in that sense, you now have a list with 3 items on it. You have the first item that says car body rl, then it's separated. Then it says gi, then it's separated. Then it's .exr, so 1, 2, 3. The next setting is where you choose which instance of that list you just created by separating the layer name by the separator value. So in this case it was dot. So if I'm choosing the first instance of this layer name when separated by dot, the information I'm receiving is car underscore body underscore rl. So at this point, I'm going to get rid of that just for a moment. At this point, I'm just going to push OK on the settings, I'll go all layers, and there we go. So you can see that in this case, when I was separating by dots and choosing the first instance, it will look for any layers which, when separated by dot, any layers that have the same information in that first instance. We can see that all of these 4 render layers here started car body RL, car body RL, car body RL. So any layers which met that criteria will be moved into a folder named for that criteria. If you ever want to undo a grouping operation, and this also is true for sorting operations, which we'll speak about in a moment, you can go to Window, History, and if I scroll up to the top, you can see that it creates a snapshot whenever a grouping operation is done. If I click this one here, you can see that we're back to where we were before we ran the grouping operation. So now we're back to where we were. Just to give a second example of how the grouping by name fragment works, I'm now going to change this to the second instance if I'm separating by dots. So now instead of looking at the car body RL, it's going to be looking at what is that information after the first dot, because we're looking at the second instance, it's skipping the first, it's saying, okay, what's the information on the second? So in this case, it would be the word alpha. In this case, it would be EXR, GI, lighting. So how many cases are there where it's the same information in after the first dot? And the answer is it will be this one, because that says GI after the first dot. It will be this one as well, that's got GI after the first dot, and so on. I would expect this one, because it has just EXR after the dot, this one, and this one, to also all wind up in the same group, because they all just have the word EXR as the second instance when splitting by dots. So let's put it to the test. I'll go OK, all layers. Yeah, there we go. So as expected, it's followed the pattern of identifying that information there. If I undo this one more time. While we're on the subject of changing the instance, one slightly different way you have to do it is, if you want to, you can choose the last instance. When separating by dot, this effectively does a job of separating the layers into their file formats. In this case, these are all .exr files, so they're all going to be moved into the same folder. But this could be useful, for example, if you'd stacked a variety of, say, PNG and JPEG files, you wanted to quickly gather them by their file format. That's a really simple and quick way to do it. So I'll take this back again. And, oh yeah, one last thing to mention is that when you're moving these layers into their folders, you have this option here called mask source. You don't have to enter anything into this, but if I, say, type in the phrase .alpha, what it's going to do is, for each one of these layers, when they're being moved into a folder, it's going to go, is there a layer which has this word in its name? In this case there is, there's several of them. And it's going to go, okay, when you're moving these layers into their appropriate folder, if there is a layer which matches that word, copy this and make it the mask for the folder that we're creating. Again, this is probably largely relevant to CG content, but it doesn't have to just be alpha, it could be any word or any information in here you like. So I'll go OK again, all layers. This time you can see it's creating masks for the folder as we go, and I can view these masks. And they correspond to the content of that alpha layer. That's because I typed the word .alpha here, and it found it on each one of these cases where layers were moved into folders. For this next feature of ProStacker, I've gone back to the original list of files we stacked again, and I'm going to be talking about the sort layers function within ProStacker. If I click this sort by dropdown, you can see the first option is layer brightness, which I'll speak about in a moment. And then once again, you'll recognize this is the same list of metadata values as we were able to choose from when we were looking at the group layers option. This sorting option basically just arranges layers relative to each other in their given group. So to show you a really simple example, I'll go with focal length again. I've set the direction to ascending. There's nothing on the filter, which means it's going to affect all layers. It won't just be picking out those that match the filter. It's going to do all of them. I'll go OK, all layers. And as a result, I can see this image at the top has the widest angle lens, the lowest focal length that is, and this one at the bottom has the highest focal length. It has the most telescopic type lens. Now, if I wish to confirm the information as the sorting algorithm just gave us, I can go back into the metadata tab as we saw earlier. I can open up the focus metadata drop down. I'll go focal length, click focus metadata, and I can see that this one at the top, it is a 21mm lens, and at the bottom it's a 85mm lens, the fresh strawberries image again. So that's a way to verify this information. It's quite quick to change around. We'll do the aperture value now. If I go back and sort this one as well, we can see that it starts at f of 1.4 and goes up to f of 10 for this value at the end. Some of the options in the sort layers, sort by drop-down can give you quite an interesting artistic effect. If I choose to sort them by image height, for example, we'll go all layers. You can see the way it arranges the shots into quite an interesting style. Some of them have a visual utility like this, others, perhaps say for example the focal length and the aperture, perhaps are most useful if you just wish to perform comparisons between the different layers. That's an example basically of how to handle the metadata values. As is the case with the group layers, you can pick custom here and it will let you type in the metadata field you wish to be sorting by if it isn't present in this list here. The last option I would talk about for the sort layers is layer brightness. This is, in my case, something which has been useful when working on CG footage, because if I'm working with a number of RGB mattes that have been rendered in order to allow me to select certain parts of the render, it's particularly helpful if I'm able to sort them by their brightness. I'll go selected layers in this case. Ooh, I just realized I got that setting wrong. It should have been sort layers by descending. What I was about to say is it's very useful having the brightest ones right at the top, because these are the ones that you're most likely going to be using when you're looking for content. It's not going to be the ones right down the bottom, which are perhaps sometimes completely empty. So that's just a little example of where this is useful in working with CG content as well. The last option in ProStacker that I'll show you in this video is the Save File on Completion option. If I enable this checkbox, you'll see that you're prompted to choose a location for a file which will be written to once the stacking process completes. So in this example, I'll just name the file Kaboom Pics after the brand of stock photos I'm using. We'll go Save. The file will always be written to a .psb file, as .psd files can have a file size limit, which could be an issue if you were stacking a very large number of images, so it'll always be .psb. I'm also going to take this opportunity to show you the way in which these options can be ran in conjunction with each other. It always does the group layers, then the sort layers, and then saves the file if it's enabled. So in this case, let's just grab a few stock photos. I won't do too many. It's going to stack them as normal layers into a new document. It will then group them by their focal length, sort them by their aperture value, starting with the highest aperture running to the smallest, and then finally it will save the file to this location. So let's just run this now. I'll go OK. It's loading the files as normal. You'll see once the file gets to 9, it will then group the layers, then sort them, and then save the file. It all happened fairly quickly, but you can see up here the name of the document has been changed to what I typed in earlier, and we can see that the layers, sure enough, have been grouped by their focal length. If I go over to the focus metadata, I can do the aperture value focus, and we can see that within each of the folders, the layers have been sorted starting at the highest aperture, running to the lowest. That's the 35mm images, and then we can see that these two are the 50, and this one's the 70. Once options have been performed, they will always be turned off when the tool resets at the end. The last aspect of ProStacker that I'll be speaking about in this video is the options available to you when choosing to load files by folder into ProStacker. I'll select a folder here, we'll do this one, the flowers, and you'll see that these two options have appeared. The first says Exclude Term and the second says Delay in Minutes. So I'll talk about the Exclude Term first. When you're loading in files by folder in ProStacker, it will assess the contents of the folder when the stacking process begins. It's possible, since at this point you don't have control over which files within this folder will be stacked, that there may be images in this folder that you don't wish to be stacked as part of the stacking process. If I open up this folder here, you can see that there are two versions of each image. The first is the main image and the second is a thumbnail for it. Main image, thumbnail, main image, thumbnail. And on each one of these thumbnail images, they have the _th added to the end of their name. I can see it here and here and here. If I wanted to load the files from this folder into ProStacker, but I didn't want to take these thumbnail images with it, what I can do in this exclude term here is I can add _th to this bit here, and now if I choose to run the file stacking operation, it won't be loading the thumbnails in, it will just be loading the main images, because any image that had _th in its name will be ignored from the list of files to be stacked. The other folder-specific option in ProStacker is called Delay in Minutes. This allows you to set a time here by which the stacking process will be delayed upon starting. This is typically used in cases where renders have been submitted to an overnight render farm and you're confident that by this time here, say 600 minutes, that's 10 hours time, you're confident that the renders will have finished and will be added to this folder by that moment. Typically in these scenarios, the folder you'd be adding here would have no items in it, but that won't be a problem. ProStacker will just remember the name on location of the folder. It won't worry about the files in it until this timer reaches 0. So to show you what I mean, I'll just go OK. The timer will begin counting down, and when it reaches 0, it will get a list of the files in the folder. Obviously, to speed things up a little bit, I'll do this again with a slightly shorter timer, let's say 0.1 minutes, and we'll run it again. As this counts down, imagine the files had finished rendering and were saved into that folder. You'll see that when it reaches 0, the list of files is accessed and then the files start stacking just as usual, really. Okay, I think this is a good point to stop with today's video. I know it's been a lot of information, so well done if you've made it this far. Just to really quickly go over what we spoke about, we started with loading files and folders into Photoshop using ProStacker and discussing what the different information available to you on the UI is during the stacking process. We then spoke about what the options are available to you in terms of how these files are loaded. Then it was on to the per layer metadata, how to see it for a single layer, how to see a single item on all layers. After that, we spoke about the grouping options available. First of all, how to do it using the metadata values, and then what we can do if there is not metadata but there is something about the names which can be used for grouping. After that, it was sorting by metadata and then also by layer brightness. And finally, how to save your Photoshop file on the completion of the stacking process, as well as using that in conjunction with the grouping and sorting layers. For part 2, I'm going to be talking all about the Update Files tab in ProStacker. This one is a little bit more complicated in its use, but in my opinion it's also probably the most powerful set of features available in ProStacker, and it's all about replacing layers in your Photoshop file with updated versions of those files, which is particularly useful I think in cases of CG rendering. I think that's about it for today, so I'll just mention that my name's Ben, I'm the founder of Grebesoft and I was also the designer of ProStacker, so if you do have any questions about what you've seen today, please feel free to leave a comment and I'd be very happy to get back to you. Hopefully see you in part 2. Thank you very much. If you would like to try out ProStacker for yourself, there is a fully featured 1-month free trial available, as was used in the video today. Just click the link in the top of the video description and it will take you to this page on the Adobe Exchange. Sign in with your usual Adobe login details and just click the trial button. ProStacker will be automatically installed on your Photoshop using the Adobe Creative Cloud. It works on Windows and on Mac and requires Photoshop version 19 and above.